Libsyn destination stats, Audible channels, and podcast measurement standards. Welcome to episode 9 of the Richard Daly podcast, where I bring you a UK perspective on the latest news and developments from the world of podcasting, internet radio, and online DJing. In episode 64 of the Feed podcast, Libsyn announced a number of new features last week, including destination stats. Destination stats will allow podcasters who use the destination publish tools for their shows on the Libsyn platform to get statistics from the various services that shows can be posted to, those services including Twitter and YouTube, for instance. Destination stats will be available to those on the advanced package, I understand. That's about $20 a month, and not to those who use the download-only option on Libsyn. Destination stats means that podcasters will now be able to see how many plays are coming from each source that they've got set up in destination publishing. I'm really looking forward to seeing how this option works out. It's going to be great to get some more detailed breakdown of statistics from when you've posted your shows to different platforms. Podcast to Radio from Blueberry now. Podcast to Radio, this is a service that converts your podcast instantly into a 24/7 internet radio stream. Blueberry have partnered with Stream Guys and created Podcast to Radio, which allows podcasters to turn their shows into an internet radio stream, which can then be distributed on a variety of channels including TuneIn, Sonus, Shoutcast, Xbox One and iHeartRadio. Now you might be thinking, didn't Blueberry launch Podcast to Radio last year? Well, yes, you'd be right. Podcast to Radio was originally launched in December 2015 in partnership with Live 365, but of course, as we know, Live 365 closed down at the end of January this year due to the changing US regulations relating to the amount of royalties payable for playing music online. The new partnership with Stream Guys is being offered at a much lower price than that with Live 365. It's now going to be $39.95 a month. That's $39.95. Stream Guys are a content distribution network. They specialise in live and on-demand streaming and host many online radio stations, including lots that moved across from Live 365 when that service closed down. The increased distribution is going to be complemented by more analytics and statistics from Stream Guys, and the aim is that will help Blueberry users measure and track their growing listener base from the wider range of platforms that they can put their shows out to. Once users sign up for the service through their Blueberry portal, it's going to automatically turn their latest 3 podcasts, I understand, into a looping stream through a specialised configuration. As new podcasts then are added to the customer's RSS feeds, Podcast to Radio will automatically add them to the internet radio stream in place of the older content, so it will cycle through the 3 latest shows. And the podcaster won't have to do any playlist editing or any other manual intervention, just to keep uploading the new shows, and the feed will get updated each time. News from Audible now. The audiobook company Audible, which is owned of course by Amazon, has announced a new service called Channels. This has actually been in beta for a while, but it's now going to be made available to all users. So rather than its typical audiobook service that Audible runs, Channels are designed to offer more bite-sized content from original content producers, and this will have genres including comedy and investigative journalism, as well as recordings of news stories from the likes of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post and others. I understand there'll also be some celebrity-hosted shows, and publishers such as Forbes and the Harvard Business Review have also been lined up to provide audio content for the service. Existing Audible subscribers will be able to get access to Channels for free, or you will be able to sign up for $5 a month for a Channels-only subscription. Once you have signed up, you will receive suggestions each month about channel content that might be interesting to you, and this will use your previous listening choices to guide recommendations to you. Audible does seem to be at pains to call this new service anything other than podcasting. It doesn't want to compare channels to podcasting. It does seem like they see this as a new way of delivering audio content of all types to their users. More news from Libsyn now. This was announced at the Podcast Movement Conference in Chicago last week. Libsyn has established a partnership with iHeartRadio, which means that thousands of new podcasts will soon be available on the iHeartRadio podcast platform, which of course already features thousands of shows and original programs. iHeartRadio will become one of the Libsyn podcast publishing destinations. iHeartMedia's digital music and streaming radio service has more than 85 million registered users, and this new partnership with Libsyn will give the 28,000 podcasts that are already hosted on Libsyn a new destination to publish their shows and hopefully expand their audiences. This now brings the total of publishing destinations available on Libsyn to 20, and that of course includes, as I said earlier on in the podcast, Twitter and Facebook, but also the obvious ones, iTunes, Google Play Music and Spotify. Podtrac's top podcast publisher ranking for June 2016 is now available. You can download the full podcast rankings of their top 10 at podtrac.com. Highlights of the June rankings include NPR keeping the number one spot. Their unique US monthly audience of listeners is 7.1 million. The top 10 publishers in the rankings generated just under 180 million global unique streams and downloads for June. An article now highlighted by James Quidland in his weekly newsletter. Rob Rosenthal in his How Sound podcast at transom.org highlighted one of the benefits of podcasting being the freedom from time constraints. This means that a podcast doesn't have to fit into the strict time limits that public radios tend to have, where stories have to be short or fairly fixed timelines, which means that podcasters can produce longer stories than you tend to get on public radio. Now, there is one podcast that Rob mentions, The World According to Sound. Producers Chris Hoff and Sam Harnett on this podcast have chosen to have a really short podcast. Their podcasts are about 90 seconds long. In each episode, Sam and Chris pick a sound, play the clip, drop a few facts about the clip and the sound, and then let the listeners listen to the audio. And that's it. 90 seconds. Short podcasts. Now onto the Rain News blog, and in this blog, Brad Hill this week has a piece titled The Download on Podcasts in Search of Standard Measurement, and Brad tackles the ongoing debate of the importance or otherwise of being able to measure the consumption of podcasts. Rob notes that most owners of podcast distribution networks today will tell you that measurement is not a problem, and that's of course because they have their own measurement and metric systems in place. Advertisers, though, tend to have a different view, and at the RAIN Streaming Audio Advertising Summit in June 2016, Subha Mudir, Director of North American Media at Kayak, said that the lack of standard measurements for podcasting means that her company doesn't see podcasting as a good marketing opportunity for their advertisements. Rob then goes on in the article to look at the differences in measuring podcast listening via downloads and streaming, and he mentions the new PodTrac rankings that I mentioned earlier. PodTrac calls its main metric for their charts unique streams and downloads, effectively combining the two types of measurement that we see. Finally, Rob mentioned something that really, at the end of the day, I guess most podcasters would say is the only set of metrics that they want, that they can't get currently. Certainly, I think most independent podcasters would say what they want simply is more information from iTunes. Rob quotes a PodTrac statistic that 65% of listening comes through iTunes and its corresponding podcast app. And of course, podcasters get no details of what happens after a listener downloads an episode from iTunes. Another interesting point from the article is that PodTrac told Rain News that 500 publishers have signed up for their free PodTrac measurement service since the April rankings came out. They're now on to their third month of rankings. Rob also mentions that the Interactive Advertising Bureau has been running a podcast working group. Now, this has been going for over a year, and a number of different articles and websites mention the work of this group. The group has been working on developing guidelines for measuring podcast consumption for over a year. Now, interestingly, though, while I was researching for this podcast this week, I visited the IAB website and I couldn't find any mention of the working group or the progress it's been making. I've put some feelers out. I'm going to contact them and see if I can find out what is actually happening with the working group and if it's still running. That's about all for this week. Just to mention that I will be at Jane Quidland's next radio conference on the 19th of September in London. If you're going to be at that event, do get in touch, let me know. I believe early bird tickets are still available. So that's all from the Richard Daly podcast for this week. If you visit my website at richarddaly.com, you'll find all my social media links, as well as the various ways you can subscribe to this show. The show notes for the episode are richarddaly.com/9. Do send me your questions or comments, and if there is a topic you'd like me to cover, then please tweet me at Richard Daly. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.